The rain fell on Seoul like a punishment from the heavens, turning the neon-lit streets into rivers of shimmering color and broken reflections. Kang Yi-won stood at the window of his penthouse office, watching the city drown beneath him, feeling nothing at all inside his hollow chest. He was 45 years old, the undisputed king of the Black Dragon Syndicate, and he had forgotten what it felt like to be truly alive. Behind him, the office stretched out in carefully calculated intimidation, all black leather furniture and steel surfaces and art that cost more money than most families earned. He had designed every detail himself, not for beauty or comfort, but to remind visitors exactly who they were dealing with when they entered his domain. The room was a weapon, just like everything else in his life, sharpened to a killing edge and pointed at anyone foolish enough to challenge his authority. His reflection ghosted across the rain-streaked glass, showing him a face that had become a mask worn so long he forgot what lay beneath its surface. Sharp jaw, cold eyes, silver threading through hair that had once been pure black, the stress of his work aging him in ways that money could never reverse. He touched the glass with his fingertips, feeling the cold vibration of thunder rolling through the building like the heartbeat of some ancient sleeping giant. The phone on his desk buzzed, shattering the silence, and his assistant's voice crackled through the speaker with the nervous tension of someone delivering bad news. Director Park is here for your 9 o'clock meeting, and he says it's urgent, something about the Itaewon situation that requires your immediate personal attention. Yi-won didn't turn from the window, just stared at the drowning city below and spoke two words that carried the weight of absolute authority and command. Send him in, he said, and he heard the door open behind him, heard the familiar shuffle of Park Sung-ho's footsteps crossing the marble floor slowly. Sung-ho had been with him for 23 years, since they were both young men fighting for scraps in the brutal hierarchy of the old syndicate structure. He was the closest thing Yi-won had to a friend, though neither of them would ever be foolish enough to use that dangerously sentimental word aloud. We have a serious problem, Sung-ho said, and something in his voice made Yi-won finally turn from the window to face his oldest and most trusted ally. The older man's face was pale and drawn, his jaw tight with a tension that Yi-won had only seen a handful of times in over 2 decades of partnership. Whatever news he carried, it was bad enough to shake a man who had seen the worst humanity had to offer without ever flinching. Yi-won moved to his desk and lowered himself into the leather chair, steepling his fingers beneath his chin in the pose that had made countless men confess their sins. What kind of problem requires you to interrupt my evening with that particular expression on your face? He asked, his voice carrying the cold precision of a scalpel. Tell me everything, and do not waste my time with unnecessary details that I do not need to hear right now. It's about the warehouse incident 3 weeks ago in Itaewon, Sung-ho said carefully, his eyes watching Yi-won's face for any reaction to those dangerous words. The accountant you dealt with personally, Young Min-soo, the one who had been stealing from us for 5 years before we finally caught his treacherous hands in the till. There was a witness, and she saw everything that happened that night, including your face in the moment you pulled the trigger on our old friend. The words hit Yi-won like ice water poured directly down his spine, but his face remained perfectly blank, betraying nothing of the storm now building behind his eyes. Young Min-soo had been one of his most trusted financial officers, a man who had managed the complex web of shell companies and offshore accounts that kept syndicate money clean. He had also been a trader skimming funds for half a decade before the auditors finally caught him, and his betrayal had demanded the most personal response possible. Yi-won had handled the matter himself, which was unusual for a man of his position who normally delegated such unpleasant tasks to specialists without personal connections. He had driven to that abandoned warehouse himself, had looked into his former friend's terrified eyes, and had pulled the trigger without hesitation or remorse. It was the first time he had killed anyone personally in 15 years, and afterward, standing over the body, he had felt absolutely nothing at all. That problem was solved permanently, Yi-won said, his voice dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that made his men instinctively reach for their weapons in self-defense. There were no witnesses because I made absolutely certain of that before I left the building that night, and the cleanup crew confirmed the area was secure. Explain to me exactly how a witness could possibly exist when every precaution was taken to ensure there would be none to ever speak of what happened. Sung-ho pulled out his phone and placed it on the polished desk, the screen showing a grainy image captured from a security camera in a neighboring building. Yi-won studied the photograph, his expression revealing nothing of the cold dread now spreading through his veins like slow-acting poison. The image showed a young woman in a doorway across from the warehouse entrance, her face turned toward the camera, frozen in an expression of absolute terror. She saw you enter the building with 2 of our men escorting the accountant, and she was still there when you left alone 40 minutes later. Our surveillance team found this footage when they were reviewing security tapes from every building within a 3-block radius of the warehouse location. They've enhanced the image and run facial recognition through every database we have access to, including government and immigration systems, but she's not in any of them. Yi-won traced his finger along the edge of the phone, studying the woman's face with the cold, analytical precision that had kept him alive through decades of violence. She was young, early 20s perhaps, with dark skin and natural hair pulled back into a puff that had clearly seen better days in the past. Her clothes were too thin for the weather, her frame too small, her eyes holding a desperate kind of intelligence that spoke of survival against impossible odds. Homeless, he observed, and it was not a question but a statement of fact that required no confirmation from his subordinate, standing nervously across the desk from him. Obviously so, Sung-ho agreed, his voice tight with the implications of what this discovery meant for all of them and their carefully constructed empire. She's been living on the streets of Itaewon for at least 6 months, according to our sources who work that area regularly and know the local population well. A ghost, Yi-won said softly, and the word hung in the air between them like smoke from a recently fired gun waiting to dissipate slowly. Her street name is Amara, but her real name, her history, her origins, all remain completely unknown to us despite our extensive efforts to identify her fully. She surfaced briefly on social media about 2 years ago, some kind of music student at a university program that fell through badly, and since then nothing. How long was she watching the warehouse entrance before I arrived and after I left that night, Yi-won asked, though he already knew the answer would be bad. Long enough to see you enter with Min Soo still alive and walking on his own 2 feet, Sung-ho said, his voice barely above a whisper now as he delivered the worst part of this terrible news. Long enough to see you leave alone and watch the cleanup crew arrive 30 minutes later with body bags and industrial cleaning supplies. The silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating, while Yi-won processed the magnitude of the threat this homeless woman now represented to everything he had built. In his world, witnesses were simple problems with simple solutions that could be implemented quickly and efficiently by professionals who specialized in making people disappear permanently. They could be bought with money, threatened into silence, discredited beyond belief, or eliminated entirely depending on the circumstances and potential for future complications. But this witness was different, and the difference made his blood run cold with a fear he had not felt in longer than he could remember clearly. She had not seen a low-level enforcer disposing of a body in some anonymous alley where such things happened regularly without consequence or investigation. She had seen him, the head of the Black Dragon Syndicate, the invisible king of Seoul's underworld, committing murder with his own hands in a moment of personal vengeance. If she went to the police, if she talked to journalists hunting for scandals, if she whispered what she had seen to the wrong person at the wrong time, everything he had built over 3 decades could come crashing down around him. His political connections would evaporate overnight as allies distanced themselves from a man facing murder charges and the inevitable investigation that would follow. His business empire would crumble as partners fled and competitors circled like sharks smelling blood in dark and treacherous waters. Find her and bring her to me, Yi-won said, and his voice had dropped to that low, lethal register that made even his most hardened men flinch involuntarily. I want to look into her eyes and understand exactly what she knows before we decide how to handle this delicate situation properly and permanently. Are you sure that's wise? Sung-ho asked, and the question earned him a look that would have killed a lesser man instantly where he stood. I didn't ask for your opinion on wisdom or strategy. I asked you to find a homeless woman and bring her to my presence alive and capable of answering questions. There was something in his voice that made Sung-ho nod immediately and back toward the door without another word of protest or caution. I'll have her location by tonight, the older man promised, and then he was gone, leaving Yi-won alone with the image on the phone and his own dark thoughts. He stared at the photograph for a long time, at the terror in those dark eyes, at the vulnerability in that thin frame huddled against the cold in inadequate clothing. She had seen his face in the moment he pulled the trigger, seen the truth of what he was beneath the expensive suits and the polished public persona. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Kang Yi-won felt something that might have been fear stirring in his chest. They found her 5 days later, not in Itaewon but in a narrow alley behind a restaurant in Myeongdong, huddled beneath a cardboard shelter slowly dissolving in the endless rain. Yi-won had his driver stop the black Mercedes at the end of the alley, dismissed his security detail over their strenuous objections, and walked alone into the darkness. She was sleeping when he found her, curled into a ball so small she barely seemed human, her thin frame shaking with cold even in unconsciousness. Up close, she was younger than he had expected from the grainy surveillance footage, maybe 22 or 23, with features that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Her dark skin was ashen with exhaustion and malnutrition, her natural hair matted and tangled, her clothes soaked through and offering no protection from the bitter cold. There was a fresh bruise on her cheekbone and a cut on her lower lip that had only recently stopped bleeding, evidence that someone had hurt her badly. He stood over her for a long moment, watching her sleep, feeling something strange and unfamiliar stirring in his chest that he could not quite identify or name. In his world, she was already dead, a threat to be eliminated as quickly and cleanly as possible before she could cause any more damage to his organization. The logical thing, the safe thing, the smart thing would be to have her killed tonight, and her body disposed of where it would never be found by anyone. But something about the way she lay there, so small and fragile and utterly alone in the world, made him hesitate when hesitation was a luxury he could not afford. It was the vulnerability, he realized, not weakness, but a kind of desperate courage that had kept her surviving when survival seemed impossible in a hostile foreign country. She was a foreigner with no documentation, no resources, no protection of any kind, existing on the margins where one wrong step meant death by exposure or violence. He reached down and touched her shoulder gently, and she came awake instantly, violently, scrambling backward against the brick wall with her hands raised in desperate defense. For a moment she didn't seem to see him at all, her eyes wild with the kind of primal fear that comes from too many nights of waking to danger. Then recognition slowly dawned in her expression, and the fear transformed into something deeper and more complicated, something that looked almost like resignation to an inevitable fate. "You found me," she said, and her voice was hoarse and damaged by cold and disuse, but there was still something musical in its cadence that surprised him. "I was wondering when you would finally track me down and come to finish what you started that night in the warehouse with the crying man." "You know who I am," he said, and it was not a question but a statement demanding confirmation of a truth he already understood with terrible clarity. "I know what you did," she replied, and she met his eyes without flinching, which was more than most powerful men could manage when faced with his cold gaze. "I saw you go in with that man who was begging for his life, and I saw you come out alone 40 minutes later with blood on your expensive leather shoes. I saw them bring the body bags an hour later, and I understood exactly what had happened in that building while I watched from the shadows praying you wouldn't see me." Her jaw trembled with cold or fear or both, but she kept her gaze steady, refusing to look away from the man who held her life in his hands. "So go ahead and do what you came to do," she said, and her voice was flat with exhausted acceptance of the fate she had been running from for weeks. "I'm tired of running, tired of hiding, tired of jumping at every shadow wondering if today is the day your people finally catch up with me and end this." Ewan studied her with new eyes, this broken girl who spoke of her own death with such weary acceptance as if it would be a relief rather than a tragedy. "Why didn't you go to the police?" he asked, genuinely curious about the choice she had made to run rather than report what she had witnessed. "What police?" She laughed bitterly, and the sound was hollow and devoid of any real humor, filled only with the cynicism of hard experience and harder lessons learned. "I'm an undocumented black woman living on the streets of Korea, invisible to everyone except the people who want to hurt me or use me for their own purposes. Who exactly is going to believe my word against a man who probably owns half the judges and police commissioners in this entire corrupt city you control so completely? I saw what you did that night, and I knew immediately that the only thing that would come from reporting it would be my own death in a cell or an alley just like this one." She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shaking shoulders, a futile gesture against the cold that had been slowly killing her for months now. "So I ran instead," she continued, her voice dropping to barely more than a whisper carried away by the wind and rain falling around them. "I've been running for 5 weeks, sleeping in a different place every night, barely eating, barely surviving, always looking over my shoulder for the men I knew would eventually come. And now you've found me, and I'm done fighting against the inevitable end that has been chasing me since that night in Itaewon when I saw too much. I'm just done with all of it, the fear and the hunger and the cold and the loneliness that never ends no matter how hard I try to escape it." Something cracked inside him at her words, some wall he had built so long ago he had forgotten it was even there, protecting something soft and vulnerable beneath the stone. He looked at this woman, this survivor who had been pushed beyond all human endurance, and he saw something that terrified him more than any rival or enemy ever had in his violent life. He saw himself 30 years younger, before the power and the blood and the endless compromises had stripped away everything soft and human inside his heart forever. He saw the hunger and the desperation, the absolute refusal to give up even when giving up was the only sane option left on the table. He saw the loneliness, that bone-deep isolation of existing in a world that didn't want you, that had never wanted you, that would grind you to dust without noticing you were ever there. He saw all of it reflected in her dark eyes, and for the first time in decades, he felt something stir in his chest that might have been compassion. "What's your name?" he asked, and the question clearly surprised her, pulling her out of her resigned acceptance of death for a confused moment of hope. "What?" she said, blinking at him like he had suddenly started speaking a language she had never heard before in her life. "Your name," he repeated patiently. "Your real name, not the one the street people call you when they bother to acknowledge your existence at all in their daily struggles." She hesitated, and he watched the calculation flickering in her eyes, the weighing of costs and benefits that came from a lifetime of learning not to trust anyone with anything real about yourself. "Amara," she said finally, and the name fell from her lips like a secret she had been keeping too long and was tired of protecting alone. Amara Washington from Detroit originally, though that feels like another lifetime lived by someone else entirely now. That's a beautiful name for a beautiful soul trapped in an ugly situation, he said, and he meant every word, though she clearly didn't believe him yet. He reached into his jacket slowly, watching her flinch and close her eyes in anticipation of the bullet that would end everything she had suffered through since arriving in this country that had betrayed every promise it made to her. Instead, he pulled out a plain white business card with a single phone number printed in black ink and nothing else to identify its origin or purpose. He held it out to her, and when she didn't take it from his hand, he placed it gently on the wet ground between them where she could reach it when she was ready. If you call that number at any hour of the day or night, someone will answer immediately and bring you to a safe place away from the streets and the cold. They will give you food and clothes and medical attention without asking any questions about who you are or where you came from or what you might have seen. She stared at the card like it was a venomous snake that might strike at any moment if she made the wrong move or showed the wrong kind of weakness. "Why would you help me when I'm the biggest threat to your entire empire?" she asked, and the suspicion in her voice was earned by years of betrayal and disappointment at the hands of people who promised help and delivered pain instead. "Why would you give me a chance to destroy everything you've built when you could just kill me right now and make the problem disappear permanently like you did with that crying man in the warehouse?" "Because everyone deserves a chance at something better," he said, and the words surprised him as much as they clearly surprised her with their unexpected sincerity and warmth. Even witnesses who see things they shouldn't see, even homeless girls who have every reason to hate men like me and everything we represent in this cruel world. Even people that everyone else has given up on and left to die alone in the cold and the dark without a single person to mourn their passing from this world. He turned and walked back toward the alley entrance, toward the waiting car and the driver and the life he had built on blood and fear over 3 decades of violence and corruption. At the edge of the darkness, he paused and looked back at her one final time, his face half illuminated by the distant neon lights of the city that never slept around them. "Call the number, Amara Washington," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the rain that continued to fall like tears from an unfeeling heaven above. "Or don't call it and continue your slow death on these merciless streets that care nothing for your suffering or your dreams of escape. The choice is yours now, and it's the first real choice anyone has given you in a very long time, isn't it?" He left her there, sitting in the rain with a business card clutched in her trembling hand and a look of absolute confusion written across her beautiful dark face. He didn't know if she would call, didn't know why he had given her the option instead of simply eliminating the threat she represented to everything he had worked to build. He only knew that something had changed in that alley, some fundamental shift in the architecture of his soul that he didn't yet understand or know how to process properly. She called the number 4 days later, half dead from a fever that had been building for weeks and finally broken through her weakened defenses with devastating force. His people found her collapsed in a doorway, burning with heat and mumbling in a language that was neither Korean nor English, something older that seemed to come from deep in her childhood memories of her grandmother. They brought her to a private clinic owned by one of his front companies, a facility that specialized in absolute discretion and asked no questions about anything. Yi-won visited her there every day, standing at the window of her room while she slept, watching the monitors track the slow return of color to her cheeks and strength to her failing heartbeat. She was sick with pneumonia, the doctors told him, along with severe malnutrition, dehydration, and the early stages of hypothermia that would have killed her within days if left untreated on the streets. It would take weeks for her to recover fully, and even then, the damage to her lungs might be permanent, a reminder of what the streets had taken from her. He arranged for private nurses and the best medications money could buy, a diet carefully designed to rebuild what months of starvation had systematically stripped away from her body and spirit. He told himself it was purely pragmatic, that a dead witness was useless, but a living one could be controlled and manipulated and used to his advantage in ways he hadn't yet determined. But he visited every single day without fail, sometimes for hours at a time, watching her sleep and trying to understand the strange fascination she had awakened in him. On the 7th day, she woke while he was there, and their eyes met across the sterile white room that had become her sanctuary from the cruel world outside. He was standing at the window looking out at the city when he heard the change in her breathing, the small confused sound as she tried to understand where she was and how she had gotten there. "Don't try to move too quickly," he said without turning around, his voice gentle in a way that surprised even him with its unexpected softness and concern. "You've been very sick, closer to death than you probably realize, and your body needs time to remember how to function properly again. How long have I been unconscious in this place?" she asked, and her voice was stronger than it had been in the alley, though still rough with illness and the residue of fever dreams. 7 days, he replied, finally turning to face her across the room that suddenly felt too small to contain everything that needed to be said between them. "You nearly died from pneumonia and exposure, and you would have if you had stayed on the streets even one more night in your weakened condition. Why didn't you just let me die when it would have solved all your problems and eliminated the threat I represent to your criminal empire and your freedom?" she asked, and the question hung in the air between them like an accusation or perhaps an invitation to confession. He moved closer, pulling a chair to her bedside and sitting down in a gesture that his security team would have found horrifying if they had been there to witness it happening in real time. The head of the Black Dragon Syndicate sitting vulnerable and unprotected beside a woman who had every reason to want him dead or imprisoned for the rest of his unnatural life. "I don't know the answer to that question yet," he said with unusual honesty, because the lies he usually told so easily seemed impossible to speak in her presence for reasons he didn't fully understand. "I've been asking myself the same thing every single day for a week, and I still haven't found an answer that makes logical sense or fits with anything I know about myself and my priorities." "You should hate me with everything you have," he continued, his voice dropping lower as he spoke words he had never expected to say to anyone living. "I killed a man in cold blood and you witnessed it happen, and by every rational measure, you should be trying to find a way to destroy me and everything I've built." She was quiet for a long moment, studying him with those intelligent dark eyes that seemed to see straight through every wall he had ever built around himself. "The man you killed that night in the warehouse," she asked finally, her voice steady despite the weakness still evident in her body language and shallow breathing. "Who was he to you before he became a body being carried out in black bags by men who didn't seem bothered by the weight of what they were doing? Someone who betrayed me after 20 years of trust and loyalty that I foolishly believed was genuine and mutual in both directions," he replied, surprising himself again with his honesty. "Someone I trusted with the most sensitive secrets of my organization, who stole from me and lied to me and would have sold me out to my enemies without hesitation if I had given him the chance. He was like a brother to me once, and his betrayal hurt more than any wound I have ever received in all my years of violence and bloodshed. Do you regret killing him now that some time has passed and the anger has had a chance to cool into something more like grief?" she asked softly. Yi Won considered the question carefully, considered giving her the comfortable lie that would make him seem more human and worthy of her tentative trust in his goodness. "No," he said instead, choosing truth over manipulation for the first time in longer than he could remember with anyone other than himself in his private moments. "I regret that it was necessary, and I regret that someone I trusted forced me into that position by his own greed and disloyalty. But I don't regret protecting what I've built from those who would destroy it from within through their weakness and their treachery. That's honest at least," she said, and something in her expression shifted slightly towards something that might have been respect or understanding. "You were expecting something different from me, some kind of monster speech about how I enjoyed the killing or how it meant nothing to me at all," he observed. "I was expecting a monster," she admitted quietly, her eyes never leaving his face as she spoke words that cut deeper than any blade ever had. "All I see is a man sitting here talking to me like I matter, like my opinion of him matters to him in some way I don't quite understand yet. A dangerous man, certainly, a man who has done terrible things and will probably do terrible things again before his violent life finally ends in blood and betrayal like all such lives do. But still just a man underneath all the expensive clothes and the carefully constructed reputation that makes people afraid to even speak your name in normal conversation." Something in his chest twisted at her words, some knot of tension he hadn't known he was carrying around inside him like a stone weighing down his heart. He had been called many things over the years, had been feared and hated and worshipped in equal measure by people who thought they knew who he really was underneath the mask. But no one had ever looked at him the way she was looking at him now, with a kind of clear-eyed understanding that saw past the power and the legend to the simple human truth beneath all the carefully constructed armor he wore against the world. She saw the man he might have been if circumstances had been different, if the world had been kinder, if he had been given choices that didn't all lead to violence and blood and the slow death of everything soft and human inside his heart. Over the following weeks, as she slowly recovered her strength and her spirit, they began to talk more openly about their lives and their histories and their secret wounds. At first, it was simple things, safe topics that didn't require too much vulnerability or too much trust between two people who had every reason to keep their guard up around each other. He asked about her life in America, about the music program that had brought her across the ocean to Korea, about the cascade of failures that had left her stranded and alone. She told him about Detroit, about growing up in foster care after her mother's overdose when she was only 6 years old, too young to understand why mommy wouldn't wake up. She told him about the grandmother who had taken her in against the protests of family members who didn't want the burden of raising someone else's broken child. She told him about learning to play piano on a second-hand keyboard with missing keys, about singing in church choirs, about the music that had been her only escape from a childhood marked by poverty and violence, and the constant fear that came with being small and black and female in a world that seemed designed to destroy people like her. She told him about the scholarship that had seemed like a miracle from God, the chance to study music production at one of Seoul's most prestigious universities with all expenses paid by donors who believed in her talent. She told him about the dream of building a life far from the poverty and violence of her childhood, a life where her music might touch people and help them heal the way it had helped her survive the worst moments of her existence. And then she told him about the visa problems that no one seemed able to fix, the university's cold refusal to help a student who had become inconvenient to their international reputation and funding concerns. She told him about the slow slide into homelessness as her savings ran out and her options narrowed to nothing, about the men who had hurt her and the shelters that had turned her away, and the slow surrender of every dream she had ever held close to her heart. She spoke without self-pity, describing the worst moments of her life as though they had happened to someone else entirely, someone she could observe from a distance without feeling the pain anymore. It was a survival mechanism, he recognized immediately, the same emotional distance he had cultivated in himself over decades of watching people suffer and die by his orders and sometimes by his own hand. You learn to separate yourself from your own suffering, to become the observer of your own tragedy rather than its victim, because that was the only way to survive certain kinds of unrelenting pain. But there was a cost to that separation, a price paid in the slow erosion of the ability to feel anything at all, even the good things that made life worth living in the first place. He began sharing things with her too, stories he had never told anyone in his life, secrets he had guarded more carefully than his most valuable business interests and political connections. He spoke of his own childhood in the slums of Busan, of a father who drank himself into violent rages and a mother who disappeared one morning when he was 7, leaving behind only a note he couldn't read yet because no one had bothered to teach him how. He spoke of the older boys who had found him starving on the streets and recruited him into the gang that would eventually become the Black Dragon Syndicate under his leadership and ruthless vision. He spoke of the things he had done to survive those early years, the violence that had marked his rise through the ranks, the moments of choice where he had taken the darker path because the lighter one was closed to him by circumstances beyond his control. He spoke of his wife, dead now 18 years from a cancer that all his money and power and connections couldn't cure no matter how desperately he tried to save her from the disease eating her from within. He spoke of their daughter, killed in a car accident at 19 that he still suspected was not an accident at all, but a message from rivals he had never been able to identify or punish properly for taking everything he loved from him in one terrible night. He spoke of loneliness so profound it was like a physical weight pressing down on his chest every moment of every day, making it hard to breathe sometimes when the silence of his empty penthouse became too loud to bear. "I've built an empire that spans half of East Asia," he told her one evening, sitting beside her bed as the Seoul skyline glittered beyond the window like a field of stars brought down to earth. "I control more money and power than most governments, and I have more enemies than I could count if I spent the rest of my life trying to list them all by name. And I would trade every bit of it for one person who sees me as something other than a monster to be feared or a resource to be exploited until I'm no longer useful." She reached out then, the first time she had voluntarily touched him since their first meeting in that rain-soaked alley where he had expected to end her life instead of saving it. She laid her hand over his, and he felt the warmth of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers, the courage it had taken her to bridge the distance between them with such a simple, intimate gesture. "I see you," she said, and the words were so simple but they hit him like a bullet to the chest, piercing armor he had thought impenetrable for decades. "I see you, Kang Yi-won, the man underneath all the blood and the power and the carefully constructed walls you've built to keep everyone at a safe distance." The days became weeks, and the weeks became something neither of them had expected or planned or knew how to handle properly given their complicated circumstances. He moved her from the clinic to a small apartment in one of his buildings, a comfortable space where she could continue her recovery surrounded by warmth and safety instead of sterile medical equipment and the smell of disinfectant. He visited every day, sometimes for an hour, sometimes for entire evenings that stretched into nights filled with conversation and music and a slowly growing connection that terrified them both equally. She began playing piano again on the instrument he had purchased and installed in her apartment without asking if she wanted it or would use it. At first she played tentatively, her fingers stiff from months of neglect and malnutrition, producing sounds that were more memory than music in their halting, uncertain quality. But slowly, day by day, the music returned to her hands and her heart, filling the apartment with melodies that seemed to come from somewhere deep and wounded inside her soul. He would sit and listen for hours, closing his eyes, letting the music wash away the blood and the darkness and the endless calculations of his daily existence in the criminal underworld he had built. She was healing him, he realized one evening, watching her play with the city lights sparkling behind her like a crown of fallen stars resting on her beautiful head. She was reaching into the frozen wasteland of his heart and coaxing something green and living out of ground he had thought permanently dead and salted against any future growth. And he was becoming dangerously, recklessly, catastrophically obsessed with her in ways that threatened everything he had spent his life building out of violence and fear and the broken bodies of his enemies. His people noticed the change in him almost immediately, because men in his position couldn't afford to change without everyone around them taking notice and calculating what it meant for their own survival and ambitions. Sung Ho pulled him aside one evening after a meeting, concern written clearly on his weathered face as he spoke words that needed to be said despite the risk of speaking them to a man who didn't tolerate criticism well. This girl is becoming a liability that we need to address before it's too late to address it without catastrophic consequences for the organization, he said carefully. I mean, you're distracted in ways I've never seen before in all our years together, making decisions that don't make sense from any strategic perspective I can identify. Your enemies are starting to notice, and there are rumors spreading through the organization that Kang Yi-won has lost his edge at the worst possible time. She's not a threat to me or to the organization, Yi-won replied, his voice carrying a warning that Sung Ho wisely chose not to ignore or challenge directly in that moment. She's a witness to a murder you committed with your own hands, Sung Ho pressed on despite the warning signs that he was treading on very dangerous ground with each additional word. She's a foreigner with no documentation and no ties to protect her from anyone who might want to use her against you in the future. If she talks to anyone, if she's captured by our enemies, if she's compromised in any way, she could bring down everything we've spent 30 years building together. I won't let any of that happen, Yi-won said, and there was something in his voice that made even Sung Ho step back instinctively. You can't protect her and run the syndicate at the same time forever, the older man said quietly, knowing he was risking his life with every word but saying them anyway because they needed to be said. Eventually, you'll have to choose between the two, and when that day comes, I pray you make the right choice for everyone who depends on you for their survival and prosperity. The crisis came 4 months after that first meeting in the rain-soaked alley, exploding into their carefully constructed world with the violence of a bomb detonating without warning in the center of everything they had built together. It started with a phone call from one of his surveillance teams in the early hours of the morning, a breathless young operative's voice telling him that Amara had been taken from her apartment by armed men who had killed the 2 guards assigned to protect her without mercy or hesitation. The Viper clan, a rival syndicate that had been probing his territory for months looking for weakness, had apparently discovered her existence and correctly identified her as a vulnerability they could exploit against him. They had snatched her from her bed while she slept, overwhelming his security with overwhelming force and ruthless efficiency, leaving behind a message written in the blood of his dead men on her apartment floor for him to find when he arrived too late to save her. Bring yourself alone to the old Incheon warehouse district before dawn or watch her die slowly over the course of many days, the message read in characters drawn with a dying man's finger in his own blood. We have been waiting a long time for this opportunity, Kang Yi-won, and we intend to enjoy every moment of your suffering before we end you and take everything that was once yours. Yi-won felt something inside him go cold and still and absolutely lethal, the calculating machine that had kept him alive through decades of violence clicking into gear with deadly precision. His first instinct was to gather every soldier in his organization and attack in overwhelming force, to bring the full weight of his empire down on the Viper clan until they were nothing but ash and memory scattered on the wind. But he knew they would kill her long before his forces could reach her, would make him watch her suffer and die as punishment for keeping her alive when he should have eliminated her as a threat months ago. So he made a different choice, the kind of choice that went against everything he had learned in 30 years of criminal enterprise and survival against impossible odds. He went alone to face his enemies with nothing but his rage and his desperate need to save the woman who had somehow become more important to him than his own life. The warehouse was dark when he arrived, lit only by a few bare bulbs that cast harsh shadows across the concrete floor and the armed men waiting for him with weapons drawn. There were at least 30 of them, maybe more in the darkness beyond his vision, and they watched him walk into their trap with expressions of predatory anticipation that would have made lesser men turn and run. The Viper clan boss stood in the center of the space, a knife pressed against Amara's throat, her face bloody and bruised but her eyes still defiant as they met his across the distance between them. You actually came alone, the rival boss said, genuine surprise evident in his voice and his expression. The great Kang Yi-won, walking into certain death for a homeless foreign girl nobody would miss if she disappeared forever from this world. I never would have believed it possible if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes right now. Let her go, and this is between you and me alone, Yi-won said, his voice calm and cold despite the terror clawing at his heart with every beat. Oh, I don't think that's how this is going to work. The Viper clan boss laughed, pressing the knife harder against Amara's throat until a thin line of blood appeared on her dark skin. I think she's the key to everything I want from you. I think you'll give me whatever I ask to keep her alive even a few more minutes. What do you want from me that you couldn't have just taken through normal competition and conflict? Yiwon asked, playing for time while his mind raced through options and scenarios looking for any possible advantage. Everything you have, the rival boss said simply, as if it was the most obvious answer in the world. The territory, the businesses, the political connections, all of it signed over to me tonight with your own signature before witnesses who will make sure you can never take it back or claim coercion. You'll sign it all over and walk away with your life and your woman, assuming I feel generous enough to let you both live after the paperwork is properly completed and witnessed, at least until I decide otherwise and change my mind about the terms of our agreement. Yiwon looked at Amara, at the blood on her beautiful face and the fear in her eyes and the stubborn set of her jaw that said she was ready to fight even now at the end of everything. He thought about the empire he had spent 30 years building from nothing, the power and respect and fear that his name commanded throughout East Asia and beyond. And he realized with a clarity that surprised him that none of it mattered compared to the woman standing across from him, with a knife at her throat and faith in her eyes that he would find a way to save her. Okay, he said quietly, and he saw shock ripple across the Viper clan boss's face at the unexpected surrender. You can have it all, every piece of the empire I built, just let her go first. Yiwon, Amara whispered, and her voice broke on his name as tears streamed down her bloody face mixing with the blood from her wounds in rivers of salt and pain. You can't give up everything you are for me, she pleaded, knowing even as she spoke that he had already made his choice and would not be swayed by her protests or her logic. I can, he said, and for the first time in as long as he could remember, he smiled with genuine peace in his eyes and his heart. I finally can give up everything that doesn't matter to save the one thing that does. But before the exchange could be completed, before anyone could move to begin the surrender he had offered, the warehouse doors exploded inward with a force that shook the entire building to its ancient foundations. His people poured through the breach in overwhelming numbers, led by Sung Ho, who had apparently been tracking him despite his explicit orders to stay back and let him handle this situation alone. The battle was brief and brutal and beautiful in its terrible violence, over in less than 3 minutes as his forces swept through the Viper clan like an avenging tide of fire and blood. When the smoke finally cleared and the gunfire faded to echo and silence, Yiwon was holding Amara in his arms while their enemies lay dead or dying around them in pools of spreading crimson. You're completely insane, she sobbed into his chest, her body shaking with relief and residual terror and something that felt like hysterical laughter at the absurdity of what had just happened. You would have given up everything, your whole life's work, your entire empire for me. I would have given up everything in a heartbeat, he agreed, his arms tightening around her like he would never let go again as long as he had breath in his body to hold her. I nearly did give it up before my people ignored my orders and saved us both from my own foolish romantic gesture. Why would you sacrifice everything for someone like me when you barely know me and I'm nothing compared to everything you've built with your own hands? Because you saved me first, he said, pulling back to look into her eyes with an intensity that took her breath away completely. Because I was dead inside for almost 2 decades, and you brought me back to life with nothing but your courage and your music and your refusal to let the world break you. Because for the first time in 30 years, I met someone who saw the man behind the monster and didn't run away screaming into the night. He pressed his forehead against hers, breathing in the scent of her beneath the blood and the gunpowder and the lingering fear that still hung heavy in the air around them. I love you, Amara Washington, he said, and the words felt foreign and strange on his tongue, a language he had forgotten how to speak. I love you, and I'm absolutely terrified of that love because I don't know how to love anything without eventually destroying it with my own darkness and my own violence. She reached up and touched his face with trembling fingers, tracing the lines of his jaw and the corners of his eyes where tears he hadn't known he was crying had left tracks through the dust and grime of battle. Then let me teach you how to love without destroying, she whispered back, her voice steady now despite everything she had just survived. Let me show you that love doesn't have to be a weapon or a weakness, that it can be a source of strength if you let it grow instead of trying to control it. They were married 6 months later in a small private ceremony on a beach in Jeju Island, far from Seoul and its memories of blood and fear and the streets where they had first found each other. She wore a simple white dress that made her dark skin glow like burnished gold in the sunset light, and when she spoke her vows, her voice rang out clear and strong across the gentle waves. I take you, Kang Yi-won, with all your shadows and all your light, with all your sins and all your attempts at redemption that never quite seem enough in your own eyes. I take the man you were before I knew you, and the man you're still becoming with every day we spend together learning how to build something new from the ashes of what we both survived to reach this moment. He couldn't speak at first, overwhelmed by the impossibility of what was happening to him after so many years of believing he was beyond redemption or love or any kind of happiness. But she waited patiently, as she always did, until he found his voice and the words he needed to say to match her courage and her faith in what they were building together. I take you, Amara Washington, as my witness and my judge and my salvation from a darkness that threatened to consume everything I was. You saw my worst secret, the blood on my hands and the violence in my heart, and you chose to stay with me anyway when walking away would have been the smarter, safer choice. I will spend every remaining day of my life trying to become worthy of the love you've shown me, and I will never stop being grateful for the miracle of finding you in that rainy alley when I expected to find nothing but another problem to solve. They built a new life together in the years that followed, something neither of them had ever expected to find or believed they deserved to have. Yi-Won slowly stepped back from the day-to-day operations of the syndicate, delegating more and more responsibility to Sung-ho and other trusted lieutenants, while he focused on legitimate business interests that didn't require violence to maintain. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick, and there were setbacks and difficulties along the way that tested both of them severely. But they faced each challenge together, and that made all the difference between success and failure, between healing and breaking, between finding redemption and succumbing to the darkness that still lurked in the corners of his soul waiting for an opportunity to reclaim him. Amara's music career flourished with the connections and resources he provided, though she made it clear from the beginning that she wanted to succeed on her own talent, not just his influence. Her first album went platinum in 7 countries, and suddenly the homeless girl who had witnessed a murder became one of the most celebrated artists of her generation. She never forgot where she came from or how close she had come to dying alone in the rain of a foreign city that had treated her as invisible and disposable. She used her platform to advocate for homeless youth and undocumented immigrants, to shine a light on the people society preferred to ignore and forget about completely. Their daughter was born 3 years after the wedding, a beautiful girl with her mother's eyes and her father's stubborn jaw, and a spirit that seemed to contain the best of both of them. They named her Min Jai, after Yi-Won's wife who had died so many years ago, and they raised her with all the love and attention that neither of them had received during their own difficult childhoods. Yi-Won would sometimes sit in the nursery late at night, watching his daughter sleep, marveling at the impossible turn his life had taken since that rainy night when he had gone to an alley intending to kill a witness and instead found his salvation. He had done terrible things in his life, things that could never be fully atoned for or forgotten or washed clean by any amount of good deeds or charitable donations. But looking at his daughter's peaceful face, listening to his wife's music drifting through the house, he felt something that he had thought himself incapable of feeling ever again. He felt hope for the future and gratitude for the present, and a peace that went deeper than the absence of conflict or danger. The ending came 10 years after that first meeting, not with violence but with silence, not with blood but with breath simply ceasing in the quiet hours of a winter morning while snow fell gently outside their bedroom window. Yi-Won's heart gave out in his sleep, the cumulative damage of decades of stress and violence and poor choices finally catching up with him despite the best medical care his considerable resources could provide. Amara found him in the morning, still warm, his face peaceful in a way she had rarely seen during his waking hours when the weight of his past still pressed down on him like a physical burden he could never fully set aside. She held him for a long time, crying softly, remembering the man who had walked into an alley intending to end her life and instead had given her everything she had ever dreamed of and more. She remembered his eyes in that first moment of recognition, the calculation that should have meant her death but instead became the beginning of something neither of them could have predicted or planned. She remembered his voice offering her a choice when no one had given her a choice in so long she had forgotten what it felt like to have any control over her own fate. She remembered his hands, capable of such violence and such tenderness, holding their daughter for the first time with tears streaming down his face because he never thought he would be given another chance at fatherhood after losing so much. She remembered his laugh, rare and precious and always surprising her when it came, usually prompted by something their daughter said or did that reminded him of the man he used to be before the world taught him that laughter was a weakness. She buried him on a hillside overlooking the ocean, far from the city and its memories of blood and power, and the empire he had eventually walked away from to find something better. Their daughter stood beside her, 16 now and looking so much like her father that it sometimes took Amara's breath away with the unexpected force of grief and love, tangled together so tightly she couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. "He saved me," Amara told her daughter quietly as they stood together watching the sun set over the water in colors that seemed too beautiful for a day so full of sorrow and loss. "I was dying on the streets with no hope and no future and no reason to believe things would ever get better. And he walked into my life expecting to end it, and instead he gave me everything I have now, including you, my precious miracle girl." Was he a good man? Min Jai asked, old enough now to understand that her father's past contained things that couldn't be discussed openly, shadows that had never fully lifted despite all his efforts at transformation and redemption. Amara thought about the question for a long moment before answering, wanting to give her daughter the truth rather than a comfortable lie that would fall apart eventually under the weight of reality. He was a complicated man who did terrible things and then spent the last decade of his life trying to become something better than what he had been before. I don't know if that makes him good or if good is even the right word for someone with his history and his choices weighing on his conscience until the very end. But I know he loved us more than he loved anything else in this world, including himself, and I know he died at peace because of that love. She looked at her daughter with eyes full of everything she felt, the grief and the gratitude and the strange sense of completion that came from having walked this journey with a man who had been her enemy and her savior and her husband and her best friend all at the same time. And I know that seeing me in that alley changed him in ways he never expected, just like seeing him changed me into someone I never thought I could become after everything the world had taken from me. They stood together in silence after that, mother and daughter, watching the light fade from the sky, while the waves whispered their endless ancient song against the rocks below. Somewhere out there, Amara knew, the world continued spinning with all its violence and cruelty and indifference to individual suffering that she had experienced so intimately during her months on the streets. But here, in this moment, standing beside her daughter on a hillside where the man she loved was finally at rest, she felt the truth of something she had only begun to understand that first night in the rain, when a monster looked at her with something like compassion in his eyes. Everyone carries secrets, she thought, watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky above them like distant witnesses to everything that had happened and everything that was still to come. Everyone has darkness inside them that they hide from the world, crimes and failures and moments of weakness that they pray will never be discovered by the people they love. But sometimes, in the space between the secret and the confession, something unexpected happens that changes everything we thought we knew about ourselves and the people around us. Sometimes the witness becomes the witnessed, and the judge becomes the judged, and the monster becomes the man he was always meant to be before the world taught him otherwise. I see you, she whispered to the grave marker that bore his name and the years that bracketed his complicated existence on this earth of joy and sorrow. I still see you, Kang Yi-won, and I always will, until my eyes close for the final time and I find you again in whatever comes next for souls like ours who found each other against all odds in the darkness of a rainy night in Seoul.